Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Teaching Critical Media Literacy as a Liberatory Project. My name is Allison Butler. I teach at UMass Amherst in Western Massachusetts, and I'm here with some of my co-authors, colleagues, and friends. Just going in order on my screen, we've got Micah Card, Andy Lee Roth, and Mickey Huff, and we are here today to talk with you about our project. I'm going to hold up the book cover, and hopefully it'll look. Thanks, Mickey. um, The Media and Me, A Guide to Critical Media Literacy for Young People. This was a book that we published in 2022 on the Censored Press imprint of Seven Stories Press, and it is, as of the time of its writing, publication, and to this today, the only critical media literacy book specifically for young people. So we wanted to share some of our information and some of the work that we did, and then also open it up to questions, conversations, anything that we can do to maybe support your project of bringing media literacy, critical media literacy into your classrooms or organizations, into your dinner time home conversations. We wrote this book with young people in mind, and specifically for young people, because there were no resources in book format specifically for young people, and we thought that that was a real gap in the field. The we, by the way, includes the folks that are here on this panel, as well as several other people, which I'll explain our authorship in just a moment. We thought that this mattered in particular because so much of our lives are uh, uh, in we intersect with the media in so many parts of our lives, and we do so for us here as adults, but we also see that our young people and our children are intersecting with the media, if not from the moment they're born, then even before they're born, with photographs that are being put up on social media of their natal development. And we thought that it might be time to provide young people with a resource for how to understand the environment in which they live, how to understand to some extent the oxygen that they breathe. So a group of us got together to put this text together, and then also wanted to really think about who we were as authors and what we might be missing. So we actually have quite the collection of authors. There's a total of 10 of us, representing a real range of humans, if you will, from some of us who are a little bit more middle-aged. Because we were writing this book for young people, we also wanted to make sure that we had youth authors. So we've got a couple of authors on the book that were at the time college students. Folks from different media backgrounds, educators, K-12 educators, activists, college professors, etc. And our colleague and friend Nolan Higdon has just joined us here as well. He's one of our authors. Um, and so we wanted to make sure that we were walking our talk, as it were, that the work that we were doing, the work that we were bringing forth, wasn't just from our own, somewhat, our own personal perspectives and our own personal education and work that we do, but also from a range that was broader than kind of just the folks that you're seeing here. And it has been so far a really valuable text. As I said, and I've said a couple of times, we wrote it specifically with young people in mind. What we've learned since publishing it is that it has been a book that has been of great value for young people. So we done right there, but also for people that we thought maybe would be a little older. We've got great interest from college students, from educators, college educators who teach first year classes, from parents who have found this a really great resource to talk about the media at home. One thing that is throughout this text is that we never bash the media. We never punish people for their media interests. We never tell young people to turn off or to stop their media use. Instead, what we really aim to do in this text, and what we aim to do in our work, is to provide our readers with the most knowledge that they can possibly have, from a critical approach, from an approach of questioning, of interrogation, so that everybody who takes up this text, or any of the, thank you, Mickey, as always, for keeping the chat up to date, any of the work that all of us are doing, so that our readers and our people who are involved with this work can have the most multidimensional view of the media possible. Like I said, we're not telling young people or anybody to turn off the media, but how about the opportunity to get to know more about that which we spend so much of our time. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Mickey and Andy, who are going to talk a little bit about the logistics, sort of how we came about doing this and why it matters within the publishing world. Nolan and I will spend a little bit of time on content, and Micah is going to tell us about the Educator Resource Guide that was written as an accompaniment to this book. So, Mickey and Andy, I turn it over to you.
Andy, you want me to start, Andy? Okay. Hey, everybody. Thanks so much. It's an honor to be here with everyone today. We are, again, we're honored to be included among so many wonderful people talking about important things around critical media literacy education. Just very quickly, Project Censored, sort of the umbrella organization that oversees the Censored Press. Many of the authors of the Media Me, of course, have long worked with Project Censored in various guises. We're a media literacy organization that's been around since 1976. We do an annual book on news literacy or underreported news stories. And we go far back enough as an organization that we were founded when critical media literacy wasn't even a term or a phrase, really. And so a lot of the things that we've been analyzing and looking at as a media watchdog for many years really lent itself easily to this kind of a book. And Project Censored largely works in the college environment of higher education, from community colleges, state colleges, all up through universities, even graduate programs, and so on. But one of the areas where we hadn't forayed as much was K-12, and there are other organizations that focus a little bit more on media literacy at K-12 for sure. But critical media literacy in the K-12 area was something that we didn't see so much of. We see organizations that talk about being literate with gadgets or how to use sites or software or hardware or what have you. And we see sites that say, this is good, this is bad, don't do this, etc. But with the Media and Me, we wanted to write something that was more positive, really proactive. And we put together a very diverse group of people from various backgrounds, ages, et cetera, as you heard Allison just saying. And we tried to lay out a book that was talking with young people, not talking to, not finger wagging, as again, you heard Allison say, but we wanted to really try to create something that could be used by instructors for multiple age groups. And even though we were aiming for around adolescence or junior high, what we've discovered is that in addition to the book being picked up by one of the largest school districts in the country for staff development, it's being used actually in first-year college courses. It's being used in freshman courses. And what we've discovered is that parents and teachers are both learning a lot from the book. So it's actually a resource guide that we intended for a certain audience that has much broader implications. And just very quickly, I'm going to talk about just a couple of the things that I worked on the book, and then I'm going to hand it over to Andy Lee Roth. A couple of the chapters in the book, we obviously talk about what are the media, the importance of critical thinking and media literacy, representation and multiple literacies. We talk about advertising, consumerism, news and journalism. And of course, we end with a resource guide on what do you want to do, where we're talking with young people. We're literally posing the question to young people, right? This is a book that is meant to drive classroom conversations. It's not meant to list what people need to go to do per se. It's a book that invites dialogue and conversation, and it connects it to really important concepts like the UN Declaration of Human Rights, right? Both Articles 19 and 25, articles on media freedom, on human rights, on the rights to education. The parts that I focused on more were on critical thinking. And I think that we can't begin soon enough in the classroom to be teaching critical thinking skills to our students and ways in which they might more mindfully interact with media. Look, our young people are inundated. We live in a very media saturated environment. And from the time kids are really young, they have gadgets and devices in their hands or screens in front of them, regardless of what pediatricians say or child psychologists may say about when people should start interacting with screens. The reality is we know that people do. And I don't want to make light of that issue, but we do want to meet people where they are. And this book, in my view, really helps give people tools to try to do that. Media literacy and interacting with media is a great way to teach critical thinking because so many of us are just there already. That's where people go to get information. That's where we go to get entertainment. That's where we go to communicate with each other. So talking with younger people about the things they're already doing is an ideal environment for us to start talking about these tools. How do you think critically and independently? What are argumentative fallacies? What are good and bad arguments? Not necessarily what's right or wrong or what positions people should have. We're not in the business of telling people what to think. We're trying to help people think more critically and independently. And again, chapter 2 in the book talks a lot about the issue of critical thinking, the nuts and bolts of critical thinking and argumentative construction. Again, we're focusing on teaching people not just what not to do, but how they can be more objective, how they can recognize their own cognitive biases. Again, we don't think you need to wait to college. Quite honestly, waiting until college is, I'm not going to say too late, but what we notice teaching at the college level, many of us that do, is that there's almost a decent amount of unteaching or unlearning that goes along with it. And so a lot of what informed this book, The Media and Me, was how do we get to tell people to not develop bad habits in the first place? Or how do we get people to practice better media habits in the first place so that when they're growing up, they become more aware of the impact media has, number one, and two, how the media can be used, how we can be the media in very productive and proactive ways. The chapter on news and journalism, I think, is also very important because it really teaches young people what amount to sophisticated ideas about maybe the propaganda model or how censorship works, or we can talk about book banning or efforts to control what's being taught to young people. Young people are very aware that they are living in kind of a battleground where they're in the middle of this, where various groups of parents or teachers or older people are trying to decide what they know. And one of the things we do at Project Censored, working with Banned Books Week Coalition, is one of the many things we do, is we really hear from students and we want to hear, what do they think that should be going on? What do they think they should be taught? Not that we're asking them to be the curricular experts, but what we see over and over again is that students don't want to have material censored. They want to be treated, like adults. They want to be treated in mature ways, and they want to talk about complicated and complex problems and issues because they already are. And maybe some of our guests will talk more to that issue as we go through the panel. But again, I just wanted to reiterate that I'm very proud to have worked on this project, very honored to be here with everybody today. And I really hope that you all reach out to us through our website, projectcensored.org. If anybody wants review copies, wants to peruse the very excellent teaching guide that Micah Card made. I put links in the chat already that I'll put in there. But we'd really love to hear from you, and we'd really love to send copies of this book to you if you're an educator or you want to really learn about this. We've made, again, strides in homeschooling communities, in the public schools and colleges. We'd really like to expand this book even more. As Allison said at the outset, I think it's a really unique publication. There's not much out there like it. And we think that it really fills a necessary void, that students really want to be talking about this. And if we have a more critically literate youth, I think they'll grow up to be more meaningfully civically engaged to really face the many challenges that we see going on around us, whether it's political authoritarianism, wanton warfare, the climate crisis. Young people have a lot of creativity and they've got a lot to live for and maybe a future to lose. And I think it's really important that we give them the tools as much as possible to help them navigate the many challenges we face. So thank you again very much for letting me be part of this. And Andy, hand it over to you.
Thanks, Mickey. Yeah, it's fantastic to be participating in this UNESCO-DCMÉT symposium on democracy, global citizenship, and transformative education. those themes obviously go to the core of what we were trying to do in the Media and Me, and what more broadly all of us who contributed as authors do in our day-to-day lives and work. Speaking for myself, if you'd asked me 3 years ago if I would have been the author of a book on critical media literacy for young people, I would have said, that's an interesting idea. If you would have asked me whether I would be the author of such a book with 9 co-authors, I would have said, that's insane. A book with that many chefs in the kitchen will never be completed. And so I would start my remarks today just by saying what an amazing process it was to come together from different places, different standpoints and life histories, and to put this book together. It truly is, I think, this will sound like self-promotion, it truly is collectively, I think, a multi-perspectival, multi-dimensional book that centers young people, as Allison alluded to in her introductory remarks. It's, to our knowledge, the first book not about young people in media literacy, but for young people in media literacy. And a lot hinges on that change in preposition. Let me make kind of 3 quick points today about the book by way of, without getting into details, just giving you some sense of what we were doing in the book and what the book brings to the table for young people. One of the major themes of the book is looking beneath the surface. And that metaphor trades on the idea that you don't need to know a lot about how media work in order to consume and access and consume media. You don't need to understand the conventions of journalism to read an article in the Washington Post. You don't need to understand how algorithms work to play a video on YouTube. But our argument is that if you're doing those things or other things like them, your appreciation, your understanding will be enhanced if you look beneath the surface and understand some about why YouTube recommends to you the videos it recommends. That's algorithmic literacy. Why the news on a topic you're interested in never seems to include people like you. That has to do with conventions of journalism and
¿Quién?
So conventions of journalism, understanding those conventions allow you to be a more proactive and engaged news consumer. So looking beneath the surface, we had interesting internal discussions about, in critical media literacy, there's all kinds of theoretical concepts and frameworks, and how much of those to bring to young people. And Dan Simon, who helped bring this book into existence, Dan is the publisher of 7 Stories Press in New York, and we work closely with them, have for years. Dan's reminded us that the approach when they do books for young people at 7 Stories and Triangle Square, their imprint for young people, is we look up to young people. And so we decided we weren't going to pull punches on the content of this book, and we were going to give people things like readers of this book were going to encounter Stuart Hall's encoding and decoding model, right? The idea that messages are encoded by the producers of media content, but they're also subject to decoding by the, quote, consumers of that content. And as soon as you start unpacking the decoding process, you see that people are much more than passive consumers. The whole point of Stuart Hall's model was that in interpreting the meaning of a media message, people could accept the encoded meaning, they could contest the encoded meaning, they could even flat out reject the encoded meaning. And that struck us as co-authors to be an important perspective to offer young people. They were probably already doing it themselves, but they give them tools, again, to talk about what they're doing when they're doing that, right? To be able to say, I disagree with that because it makes this assumption. So we didn't pull our punches in terms of kind of the theoretical tools that we offered up. And there's, in fact, I won't try to show it to the screen because it will just be a jumble, but we have a fairly extensive glossary of terms that's intended as a kind of a supplementary resource to the main body of the text. The last point I'd make, Allison mentioned, and I know Nolan's going to talk a little bit more about the action steps that the book concludes with. I just want to touch on one of those briefly now, because I'm so proud of it. And it's actually something, not because I came up with it, I'm so proud that we came up with it, because it's something that caused me to pause and reflect on my own media consumption habits. And this is a point we make in this concluding chapter about what do you want to do. And one of those points is engage with media at a slower pace. And I'm just going to read this one passage because it's as concise and on target as anything I could extemporize now. Critical media literacy will help you slow down to make sure that you are engaging the media at a pace that makes sense for you, rather than as a speed dictated by media producers or peer pressure. And I think that simple point is one we've seen in the past couple of weeks, what can happen when reputable, high-profile news agencies rush to get news out as fast as possible at the expense of accuracy. And I think we've all experienced it in our own daily lives when you receive, when you see a post from a friend or a family member and you feel some pressure to respond quickly, even if there are other things that you need to be doing at the moment, so as not to seem rude or ungenerous in some social platform. So those are things, I think, looking beneath the surface, looking up to students and young people, and engaging at our own pace. Those are some of the highlights to me of what we packed into The Media and Me. Thanks. And I guess at this point, I'll pass it back to you, Allison.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andy. I think that to your comment, Andy, about how writing this book and working with this book has sort of made you think about your own media use differently. I would just want to echo that, particularly with everything that is happening these days in terms of the war happening in across Gaza and Israel and the West Bank. It is confusing and complicated. It is difficult. There are so many things to think about. I am not a scholar of any of that, and yet I want to make sure that I'm being responsible. So quite frankly, I've turned to our own book to kind of help me dig through some of the challenges of our very difficult current events time. How can I move away from some of the emotion, not to deny them, but to try and think more carefully, to try and think more cautiously. How can I myself slow down from barreling through headlines that probably aren't going to be the most complex or productive way of understanding what is happening? How can I think differently and think through maybe some other resources that could be helpful for better understanding the current events in which, the times in which we live. And then, quite frankly, how can I potentially bring those resources and that understanding to my own classroom, where I teach a class this semester on theories and representations of education, but my students there are being educated. And so how can I support them in their own personal education, as well as our classroom education, and acknowledge just the humanity of it and the humility, that this is a project in sort of taking a bit of humility and saying, I still have a lot to learn. and how we can kind of counteract the sort of hyper individuality, right? Like our social media is called social media, but in fact it's very isolating, and it often encourages us, by its structure, by its system, encourages us to be alone. So if we can practice engaging in difficult conversations, engaging in topics of the media that are hard for us, that we misunderstand, that we're confused about, if we can do that together, if we can do that in our classrooms, if we can do that over our dinner tables, we do a little bit of work to push back against that sort of hyper individuality, that aloneness that says that we're supposed to be involved and belonging to something, but really from a kind of our own private space, without community, without connection. So I think that in many ways, this book is a valuable resource for ourselves, as well as for the readers, the young readers and the teachers out there. Nolan, I would like to ask you to talk specifically about that last chapter. Chapter 8, what do you want to do? A resource guide. And I'll preface it a little bit by saying we recognize how difficult it is to climb inside of the media, right? They're designed for us to be passive recipients, and it's a lot of work to be an active recipient. So we get through, in this text, we get through 188 pages of kind of media deconstruction, content and system deconstruction. What we didn't want to do was to end the book there with this idea of like, great, now you know a lot about deconstruction. We wanted to give our readers an opportunity to kind of make change, if they so chose, in their own lives, and make change in ways that might be meaningful to them. So Nolan very creatively took from the title, The Media and Me, and came up with titles of a whole bunch of different ways that young people, readers, teachers, families could start to make change if they so chose, that were manageable and approachable. So Nolan, if I could turn that over to you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Allison, and thank you, everybody. It's nice to be here, and thank you to the organizers. And it's nice to see some friendly names on the screen here today. Yeah, I won't echo too much before I jump into the last chapter here, but I do want to say a lot of us have talked about how important it was to make this text something that young people could identify with and make it in a conversational tone. But it's also a resource for educators, I think, at a critical time when there's a lot of pressures on educators to talk about media in the classroom. This is a valuable resource for them, and in that way, I think it's a great alternative. I won't, remind folks about all the corporate media literacy that are out there trying to colonize the classroom, but this is a great alternative to that, and that's why we were excited about it. And as Allison noted, we wanted to part of being a great educator is to anticipate the questions you will receive. And, we know from deconstructing media in the classroom, eventually students get to the so what do we do about it question. And we want to make sure that there was a substantive answer to that in the end of the text here. And so, one of the things we talked about, the first thing we mentioned there is we encourage readers to maneuver like a media citizen. So that is to say, identify as someone who's using media as part of being a citizen, not some passive consumer. Andy talked about the necessity of engaging with media at a slower pace. I don't think I could do anything better than what Andy said on that front. And then we talked about defending freedom of expression as a human right. We mentioned some of our concerns about, the growing global crackdown, the censorship, if you will, and why it's important to maintain a commitment to freedom of expression as a human right in that section. We encourage, again, this is not a protectionist book that tells every young person to turn off media. It encourages media use, but we say increase the amount of valuable content. So if you are gonna spend that time, make sure you're spending with the time that the media you enjoy or get something from. Then we talk about acknowledge the context. This is the way of saying look at the deeper creation of media, the political economy of media, if you will. I think this is where certainly the critical scholars here differ from a lot of other media literacy folks. We want to go behind the scenes and look at that context. You guys mentioned this a little bit earlier, but then we go into analyze representation, never forget the means of production. And then we end talking about drawing on independent media sources. As Mickey mentioned, Mickey and Andy and Allison, longtime members of Project Censor and the Media Freedom Foundation. And they've always advocated for this, broadening that media scope or diversifying the media diet, and the drawing on independent media sources talks about that. Then we mentioned make solutions-based journalism a priority, which I think is critical. A lot of students who I've talked to over the years say I don't read the news because it's depressing, and there's no solution in there. There's nowhere to go. There's nothing to do. And I think, as hard as it is, as someone who believes in journalism, to hear that, there's a lot of truth in that. And I think that's really important. I'm glad we added that section on, focusing on that solutions-based journalism. And then we end, the last piece of advice we have in the chapter is engage in activism, not slacktivism. And this is where we point out that there's a lot of pressures, particularly coming from corporate media, to reduce activism down to, some nice virtue signal at the end of your email or something you post on social media. But we point out there that activism is something much more deeper. It takes a lot more participation. It has a lot more influence in that sense. And so we talk about that at the end of the chapter. And I'm going to turn it back to Allison here in a second. And I think I know where this is going next, but I want to say for these steps, we also have resources with them as well, which I think is also critically important. We've all read those texts where, it's a 200, 300 word text, and then they have one paragraph of 6 ideas with no resources or explanation. That's not this book. We really went in depth in this chapter to explain these and offer resources. And I think that speaks to where I started about how this is such a great resource for teachers in the classrooms when students do ask those critical questions about, so what can I do? Where can I go? Here in the text, we have a starting point for that. So I'll turn it back over to you, Allison.
Okay, thank you, Nolan. Yeah, and so if here in the text is the starting point, we are also a group of people, as we've said multiple times, that we wanted this to be a resource for classrooms. We wanted it to be a resource for families. We also recognize that teachers and families have way too much already on their plate. And so we didn't want to also say, oh, and by the way, now change everything you've ever done and start over from the beginning, kind of on your own. So we brought in our wonderful friend and colleague, Micah Card, to make an educator's resource guide that would help teachers and help anybody who is interested in it not have to reinvent the wheel, right? And not have to add more to their already overstuffed plates. So Micah, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about the resource guide.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you all so much for being here. And I just want to express how thankful I am to be part of the project through this extra supplementary pedagogical guide. It's really been a delight to think through it, and also just to get to really work with you all and hear the sort of tenets behind the book, as opposed to just reading and reformulating for educators. Because ultimately, I think what is so unique about the Media and Me project is that it's about ways of thinking, not what to think, both in its content, but also in its sort of more meta political commitment. So at the most basic level, what the teaching guide is that it is a sort of mini distillation of the book, retranslated again for adults who might be using it. So it's not to sort of summarize or just repeat the book, but there are some sort of chapter by chapter distillation, so some summarizing some of the key terms, so that the educator, the sort of blank slate educator, right, can refer to it quickly, but also each chapter then is accompanied by a set of starter discussion questions and experiences that could be extended out depending on how conversations around media go in a classroom or other sort of educational context. At a nuts and bolts level, that's what that is, but it's written intentionally with the sort of themes of the book and also the input of the authors in terms of what's important to it, and sort of represents the values of the media and me. And so the way that I interpreted those are at least 4 levels. So one, that media literacy is not about prohibiting anything in media. It's not about censorship. It's not about shame around media use either, which I think is an especially important element of talking to young people and children about media. I think there's plenty of messaging for adults and for children about how scared people should be about children on the internet, about children having phones. I think there's enough fear mongering there that I don't know that shaming can actually produce a pedagogical like insight of any kind or an educational like experience. It can only kind of retrench. And so that important tenet also fuels the idea that the critical media literacy tenet that media is a construction and thus can be deconstructed as well. And so the sort of deconstruction is the pedagogical goal of the exercises that are in the teaching guide. And then on that level as well, so the teaching guide is also structured in a critical pedagogical lens. So really believing that pedagogy is based on exchange of ideas in a non-hierarchical context. So nowhere in the teaching guide do I recommend to teachers that they should tell them these key terms about thinking and then tell them to like quiz students on it. It's about engaging conversations that can be open and adaptable to any context. It doesn't have to be that this is for a media class. It doesn't have to be that this is for English class only, but rather it's a set of conversation starters or ways of looking at things that could be adapted to any context, with just the simple assumption that media is important all the time and it's relevant all the time and can be engaged openly based on the most important principle, which is that children and young people are capable and competent, so able to engage in political discussion, and that also that their feelings and their ideas matter very much, and that can be extended into an aspect of their media literacy. So just the very idea of how do you feel when you engage with media can be a really important, powerful, transformative idea, especially for children and young people who are often told how they should feel. So how do you feel? What does that make you think about? What do you notice when you engage with a piece of media? Those are the most important conversations that you can have just to sort of stimulate the critical thinking that it takes to make decisions about media going forward. So essentially those tenets are, I hope, baked into this educator guide, which should complement the book and provide just sort of like, if nothing else, then some inspiration about how to pedagogically engage in also a critical media literacy lens. I'll pause there.
Thanks so much. And as you can see in the chat a couple times, Mickey has shared some information, but also one of the things that I hope is clear in the chat, but also maybe we can make more clear explicitly, is we also don't want this to be something that costs teachers or schools a lot of money. In addition to recognizing how busy teachers and schools and families are, we also really recognize how tight resources can be. So this is something that we also really work very hard to make manageable for teachers, manageable for schools, manageable for families. The educator resource guide is free. And we will do whatever we can, whatever is within our power to support teachers and schools that might not be able to afford it. Like, what can we do to help you too? Mickey, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I thank you so much, Allison, for bringing that up. I just wanted to point out that we've officially donated hundreds of copies of the Media and Me to schools and libraries and educators around the country. We've been able to do that with the support of some grants and other supporters. But yes, please check the chat for the projectcensored.org, the contact information. As Allison said, we'd love to get these resources to you as best as possible and work with you on in whatever way we can. So I just wanted to reiterate that, Allison. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of our big overarching goals with this book is to make critical media literacy more available, kind of full stop, right? And so if we have to sort of think creatively about that, hey, look, if you can afford the book, buy it, right? But
it's less than $20. It's not an expensive book, but
but please don't look at the price tag and say, that can't happen. We don't have the budget for that, because we would really much rather work with you for figuring out a way than to have it be something that sort of seems like it's out of reach. We absolutely didn't want this to be out of reach at all. I'm looking at the time and seeing that we have about officially 20 minutes. So this has been us kind of talking to you, at you about this work. We'd love to take any of your questions, comments, or concerns, things that you'd like to know more about, maybe ways that we can support you along the lines of this, this fabulous symposium here. Like, what can we do to be part of a transformative education environment, and how can we support you? And also, if folks don't want it, we can happily take stuff in the chat too, if that's easier for folks, depending on your space. I'm just going to, because we're recording, I'm going to read the chat just to make sure. Julie has written, I really appreciate your approach, distancing from the usual shaming. The structure presented is really appealing and looks like a pedagogical gem. Congrats. And then a starry face emoji and a heart. Thank you so much, Julie. I hope that if you can get yourself a copy of the book, or if we can support you getting a copy of the book, that it will prove to be exactly that in your own space as well.
Without divulging too much attention on that theme of shaming, we're all critical media literacy scholars and activists, obviously. But before we went live here today, I won't name names, but one of us was sharing with the other that the Britney Spears book is here. And numerous times during the production of this book, the thrashing through the ideas and the writing, we had sidebar discussions about our favorite pop cultural guilty pleasures, right? And so, I mean, the reality is, and we talk about this in the book, like, we don't have to be kind of like perfect activists all the time, 24/7. There's room to, dive into whatever your favorite trashy, TV series is, but you can do so with your critical faculties waiting in the wings, should you want or need them. And I think that's a really important, there's a kind of balancing act there that I think the book tries to model. And that certainly we do in our classrooms and in our engagements with young people. Without going into details, but I could tell you how many hours of graduate school I spent watching Melrose Place and 90210, right? Yeah, I'll stop there.
Absolutely. And Mike has just put in the chat, have used TikTok so much that I burned my screen. Way to go, Micah.
Hey, Project Censored is on TikTok. So if you're interested in seeing how media literacy works in these platforms, do check out Project Censored's Instagram, TikTok, etc. We're also on Facebook. So we practice what we teach, including, as Andy and Micah are saying, we also have our guilty pleasures, but these platforms and tools can be used for a lot of productive reasons. In fact, one of Nolan's students found a person on TikTok using some of our work from United States of Distraction, another book we did, where they used it routinely to critique and deconstruct media. And frankly, that's where a lot of young people are, and that's what they're doing. And so they're learning things from these places. I just quickly wanted to point out that in addition to Micah's great free teaching guide, we have great call out boxes and in-chapter activities, and we have brilliant illustrations from Pete Glanting. So there's really great artwork and illustrations in here that that really kind of like make the further, I think, accentuate or underscore the many points that we make throughout the book. So I just wanted to make sure we gave Pete Glanting a shout out as well.
Anything else that we might be able to tell you about, that we might be able to share with you, or if there's stuff that you would want to know more about, or if you think maybe there needs to be a second edition. That is, I mean, that is one conversation of in addition to talking about Melrose Place and Britney Spears while writing this text, we also talked about how we didn't want to date ourselves. So we were really careful about in a weaving through discussions of the media without talking about media that were super trendy or popular at the time of our writing, at which point we would have then dated ourselves. So we did try and be somewhat broader in our discussions of content and our discussions of technology. But certainly as we were writing it and as it was going through the publishing process, we were all collectively thinking about the fact that not much in this book talks about surveillance technologies, because it's not that they weren't important at the time. They obviously were important and they remain important, but it wasn't it wasn't quite the level of conversation. We were doing this largely in the midst of COVID. All of us are in different geographic areas, so we probably would have been digital anyway, but we were just exponentially digital, if you will, by writing this and researching this and publishing this during the sort of height of the COVID pandemic. And we have talked casually about, hey, we should really be thinking about how to talk a little bit more about surveillance as a way for young people to understand it, right? Nolan and I are at the tail end of a project. It is designed for teachers and for like grown-ups to think about surveillance technologies in education. But we, to be responsible to the larger project, might need to consider sort of the kind of what's coming up and what's around the bend. So if there's any input that you might think of for a what's next, we'd love to hear that too. Again, I'm going to read the question because I know we're recording and sometimes that doesn't show up on the recording. So we've got a question here. Are you having specific sections for each app or platform, TikTok, Insta, Facebook, Snapchat? If not, you could do add-ons for teachers who deal with challenges related to overuse in their classroom to have a non-shaming guidance. Yeah, I mean, we talk in the text about different apps. We do talk about different platforms. We talk about, but we don't dwell on them, again, to avoid a kind of trendiness. I think TikTok is probably going to be around for a minute or two. I don't think it's going to disappear within the next month or so, but we didn't want to dwell on it. But I think that that's a really interesting idea about, add-on specific, like modules, if you will, maybe, to support teachers in thinking about in addressing what is trendy, right? In addressing what is current events, what might need to be coming up in their classroom, but to have some of those kind of foundational support systems is really the way that we were thinking about the text. Thank you very much for that.
Can I add on just about that?
Please.
Because also in the teaching guide, I think, I can't remember off the top of my head, I think it's in the first or second chapters, there's some like open-ended questions that could be directed to students about just literally what is your relationship to media, and that includes apps, that includes everything you do on your phone or online, like how much time do you spend, like, and that's not to evaluate, but just to like note, like there's a potential activity that's literally just make a log, but then also noticing how do you feel after you've spent 5 hours on TikTok, personally. How do you feel? Why do you think you might feel different with 5 hours on TikTok than 5 hours on YouTube? What is it between these two things that is different? And really redirecting that analysis onto the actual media, as opposed to this idea that like people should be constantly self-disciplining around them, and instead noticing like, how does the actual app, like what is it about this thing what do I get out of that? What is it that I like about it? And is that something that's only available here? And if so, like that's okay too, but how do you evaluate those things for yourself without feeling like that internal like regulation has to happen all the time.
Thank you. Miranda, I see your hand is raised. Also, it's
Yeah.
really nice to see you.
Nice to see all of you. Thank you for this, and wonderful to hear about the book. I'm excited to jump into it one of these days soon. And thinking about, Micah, what you mentioned, and also Andy earlier, talking about rushing the news, about the mistakes that are made when doing this in terms of sharing. And you spoke a little bit about the emotional component that might push you to do this out of, obligation for a friend in support. But I'm also really curious about the other emotional push that might not necessarily be in obligation to the person who posted it, but instead your emotions are triggered by the content, and that alone pushes you. And I think in our current context, this is happening, quite regularly for all of us who are traversing the muddy waters of social media. So do you speak about that in terms of affect and how that is used to perhaps encourage engagement without taking the time, to think critically about the material before sharing, before commenting, before emotionally reacting, which can sometimes feel so easy to do?
I'll start by saying yes. One of the things that Andy commented on a little earlier was this notion of slowing down, right?
Mhm.
And we talk about sort of pausing and thinking through, and trying to do a little kind of that the slowing down is really what grabs it for me, because I think so much of our media encourage us to zip through really quickly, right? If we're on TikTok or Instagram or any of those things where we do literally get to just scroll, right? It's what we're asking is for folks to pause, right? To slow down, and then to think through what is happening there. As a way of sort of being cautious and being careful, being responsible to oneself as well as to one's community, right? To Micah's point about like, how does it make me feel when I do this? Is it whenever I talk to students about it, they talk about how there's just no attention. They just go through it, and then they feel kind of like, oh my God, what did I just do? Right? I do an activity in my media literacy class where I have them document for 24 hours what media they use and for how long. And I say there's no judgment. There's no judgment at all. And they are doing a lot of I suppose I should specify there's no judgment for me. They do a lot of self-judgment of like, oh my God, I can't believe I couldn't go more than however many seconds, minutes, whatever, without either their own kind of mindless scrolling or being walking across campus and being sort of inundated with stuff, right? So we try and work it in that way, as a way of kind of thinking through the time, as not you spend too much, right? Because that begs the question of, so what's the right amount? But what is the value of your own time, right? It is that behind the scenes, that kind of thinking through the value of one's own time. Mickey, you want to add on to that?
Just very quickly, I wanted to add, in addition to that, sort of tacking on to that important topic, we also talk at the end of the book what else you can do, and that's engaging in constructive dialogue. How do we engage with different people and different ideas and different perspectives, particularly if we're not so used to hearing them? And particularly if you're into, in news literacy, when you get information from independent sources, you tend to have different perspectives and narratives than those that are represented in the corporate media or the establishment press. And so we have a whole list of guidelines of, well, how do you talk to people with whom there are disagreements and there are difficult things? And, in addition to, being on social media a lot, how do we also deal with other potential negative issues and negativity biases? And one way is by focusing on how we communicate, not just what we're communicating, because how we communicate conveys sometimes a very different message than what we think we're communicating. And we express that to young people straight up. We're like, guilty as charged, the older people writing the book. And we encourage them to seek out difference, of opinion, and give them strategies for how to listen critically, how to be empathic listeners, the importance of reciprocity, not to be doormats and to tolerate hate and racism and sexism and ableism and all the other horrible isms, but we encourage them to go out on the limb, and it's okay to be wrong or not know everything. And that's part of curiosity and learning. And we don't want, just like we don't want to shame young people for using media, we don't want to shame people for having not thought through things the whole way yet, or we're still learning something yet. And I think that that's a real message of the book, really through the whole thing, is that we want to encourage engagement and encourage people to be who they are and explore who they are, because that's really what's so exciting about being alive. And media, for better or worse, is a big part of that. So the sooner we embrace it and start teaching younger people how they can navigate it a little more positively, I think we have a much better chance to work on the challenges in the future. You know, we can't expect younger generations of people, heaped with the weight that we've put upon them, to just suddenly figure out, you know, what to do about it. We, I think, have an obligation as educators and as media literate citizens to really help pass that baton along and be part of those solutions with young people.
Thanks, Mickey. Andy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, just very quickly, we, in the section on that Nolan talked about earlier about activism versus slacktivism, we have a distinction between platforms and pedestals, right? And if you think about media, like oftentimes media function as pedestals. It's all about the building up and tearing down of celebrity figures a lot of the time. And that's when that is transposed to activist circles, it's especially damaging, I think. And so we actually, one of the resources Nolan mentioned, each of these, what do you want to do elements has resources attached to it. And the one for platforms and pedestals is a short video based on the book, The Purpose of Power by Alicia Garza, who's one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, who makes that distinction based on their own experience of how social movements work or fail to work when people are put up on pedestals, as opposed to when we use media as a platform to amplify voices and to give people space that they might not otherwise have.
Thanks, Andy. I'm seeing in the time that we're just about done, so I wanted to read this one last chat. Thank you, Micah. Again, because of the recording might not capture this. It's also so important that the book gives young people language and conceptual tools to understand the political and economic interests of media platforms. If we can name and understand something like the attention economy, then we can better understand the emotions / responses they provoke in us. Thanks so much, Micah, for adding that in. We are almost just at, well, in my time zone, almost just at 5:30. So if there's any last minute questions or comments, anything anybody wants to bring up quite quickly, I don't want to run people over time because I know that there's so many other things going on. But as Mickey has put in the chat, all of our Project Censored links for the book, for the Educator's Research Guide, for other things that you might be interested in participating in or learning more about from Project Censored. I feel quite confident speaking for all of us that we'd be more than happy to talk to anybody individually or collectively about anything we can do to bring this book or this type of work to classroom or activist space. Mickey has just put in his email. That's going to be the best place for, certainly for Project Censored, as well as kind of access to the text, to the media and me. And all of us, I think, would, are just really wanting to make sure that critical media literacy becomes part of the oxygen that we breathe, not necessarily corporate media. That we want that to be our conversation. So thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for your comments and your questions. Again, if there's anything we can do, please do not hesitate to reach out. This is just a fabulous symposium, and we're all really just hugely honored to be a part of it. So thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.